setting Washington's agenda. The Morning Majority, 5 to 9 on 630 WMAL.
It is 8:37. Brian Wilson, Brian Neiman, Mary Catherine Ham. Brian Wilson checking his rundown. We got the weather. We got the traffic. Okay, now it's time for Jim Angle, the chief Washington correspondent of the Fox News Channel, a man that we lovingly and affectionately referred to in the halls of Fox News as Jangle. and I've always called him, because we're both from Texas, and this is what you call people named Jim from Texas. I always called him Jimbo.
Jimbo.
Hey, Jimbo, how are you?
I'm good, Brian. Brian and Mary Catherine, I'm good. Thanks.
It's good to have you with us. Hey, listen.
Call me Jingle if you like, but I don't have any.
You got spurs that jingle, jangle. Hey, listen, we were watching last week, and my mouth fell open. I couldn't believe it when AARP said that they are now, as an organization, ready to accept cuts to Social Security. And the organization's policy chief, a guy by the name of John Rother, said, hey, the ship was sailing, and I wanted to be at the wheel when that happens. Were you surprised by this? And what does it mean, Jim?
Well, I'd say this is fascinating, Brian, because the problem for Social Security is the same problem for Medicare and other entitlements, because, we're among the baby boomers. There are 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day for the next 19 years. So all of these programs that we promised the elderly back in the 60s, which seemed like a great idea to some people at the time, now they look at them and go, oops, we are tens of trillions of dollars short in paying for them.
We're hosed.
Now, so the problem with Social Security is a little different from Medicare, because Social Security is a closed system. It has a trust fund. You pay into it. The trust fund will run out in 2036. But in the meantime, Social Security does not add to the deficit, except that in the trust fund, we borrowed all that. Politicians borrowed all the money in the trust fund and spent it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So now they have to pay it
Oops.
back. And Social Security is starting to pay out more than it takes in. So it turns to the federal government, says, you owe us, and we need to collect this year a couple $100 billion. So to that extent, it makes the deficit system worse. But in reality, Social Security does not add to the deficit, and the reason that AARP did what it did was because in the deficit talks, people are looking for places to cut, places that they can get revenue. And what AARP was saying was, look, we are not part of the deficit problem. Do not try to balance the budget or reduce the deficit by taking money from Social Security, because we're not part of that problem. Their difficulty is that they have resisted changes ever. And Senator Reid, he came out not too long ago and said, we don't need to worry about that until 2030. Well, the people who followed this say, if you wait until 2030, you've got a disaster on your hands.
Trouble,
because
right.
in 2036, there will be an across-the-board cut for everybody of 23%.
Wow.
And a lot of elderly are poor, and that would be devastating.
This may be a little early for this discussion, but I'm curious because as part of the extending the Bush tax cuts, the president came up with the idea of a 2% cut in the payroll for your Social Security taxes, which expires at the end of the year. I'm wondering how AARP or Democrats and Republicans, for that matter, feel about extending those, or will they just expire to sunset?
Well, they will. There is some talk now of extending them. The president's
really
raised that, and others have. But keep in mind, they make that up to the trust fund. They don't take that out of the trust fund. It is essentially a tax cut equal to the Social Security contribution, but it not in place of it. So they don't take that out of the Social Security funds. But look, there's a real problem now. We have gotten to the point where you cannot proceed as you were. You have to do something to cut debt, or else, I tell you, I can imagine a set of circumstances where we have something like what is going on in Greece and what is now happening in Spain and Portugal and other places, where people are coming out and saying, you can't cut our benefits, you can't cut services. Well, we're at the point where that is going to be a necessity.
Well, Jim, that's what I wanted to ask you about. You watched the fight in 2005, and the big problem was, you couldn't sell anybody on, I thought it was a noble effort by the Bush administration to tackle this problem. You couldn't sell people on it. They got really scared. They got really mad. And if you watch the polling at the beginning of this Medicare discussion, you see a little bit of that going on. And are we at a point where folks have realized there's a problem? Or is there a sea change? The AARP thing feels like a different era to me. If the AARP is admitting that there's an issue, it feels like a different day, but will the public go along with it?
Well, it's interesting. The AARP came out and said, oh, no, we haven't changed our position. Our position has been the same for the last decade. Well, that's not the way most people remember.
No.
But they are willing to contemplate benefit cuts and changes. Now, what they'd most like to do is increase the cap on a taxable income.
Right.
You now pay Social Security on the first like $108,000 of income. They'd like to lift that cap, but that's not enough money. And if you make people pay more taxes, they also get more benefits, and it would be a tax increase on the middle class. So for all sorts of reasons, that's a non-starter, really. The 2005 issue, when President Bush suggested having personal accounts inside Social Security, it was a small thing. It was 2%. You could put it anywhere you wanted to. You could have bought Treasury bonds. You could have bought stocks, whatever. The problem was that took money out of the system.
Right.
And that's why you had a lot of people. The opposition was sort of divided among people who thought, well, this might not be a bad idea, and those who just didn't want it, period. But those who thought it might not be a bad idea, but you'd have to make up that money. And one thing I should point out is that when you die, you get nothing. You get like a death benefit of $1,000, but you do not get any of that money that you paid in. President Bush's proposal would have been an advantage most for one group, black males who die at a younger age, and all that money they paid into Social Security just disappears. That would have been money they could have left to their heirs, might have helped a kid go to college, something like that. So the idea of what he was doing was sound, but the politics of it were toxic.
Jim, we got about a minute left, and I just want to ask you about these comments by Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, who said they might go along with a temporary rise in the debt limit while they continue the negotiations. Is that going to happen, do you think?
Well, here's what he's concerned about. He's saying, look, if you don't find some cuts in entitlements, and Medicare is the big problem here, 60% of future deficits come from entitlements. 60%. So if you don't deal with that, you can't deal with the deficit. You cannot address the problem if you don't do something to cut all these benefits for baby boomers like me. And there's no way to get around that. And what he's saying is if you can't come up with it now, if you can't figure it out, if you're not willing to confront that issue now, then you're going to have a temporary increase, and we're going to have to come right back to that. And that means that the issue remains on the table. People still have to wrestle with it. And at some point, politicians have to deal with this. It is unpleasant. It is distasteful. It's not the kind of thing they like to do. They like to be Santa Claus, not Grinch.
Right.
But I'm afraid the season has changed here. We have to do something about entitlements.
Thank you, Jim. Jangle, we appreciate your time as always.
Hey, keep an eye on Rosen, okay? It's your job now,
I watch
right?
him